Blinking his 6 compound eyes in rapid succession, Dr. Korthak Senex adjusted his ceremonial teaching robes and surveyed the lecture hall with barely concealed disdain. The auditorium stretched before him like a monument to academic excellence, filled with eager young minds from across 17 different species, all here to learn about the most dangerous predator the galaxy had ever encountered: humans. "Settle down, cadets," his voice resonated through the hall's acoustic amplifiers, causing several antennae to twitch nervously. Today we examine the command hierarchy of the Terran Colonial Defense Force, focusing specifically on their most notorious military leaders. The holographic display materialized above his lectern, showing detailed organizational charts and personnel files. Korthak's mandibles clicked with satisfaction as he watched his students lean forward with interest. After 40 years of teaching xenobiology at the Imperial War College, he still enjoyed watching young minds grapple with the terrifying reality of human warfare. "As you can see," he continued, gesturing with one of his forearms, "the human military structure appears deceptively simple compared to our own sophisticated hierarchies. They use primitive titles like General and Colonel, which roughly translate to our concepts of Battle Prime and Squad Dominant." A tentacled student in the third row raised an appendage. "Dr. Senex, why do we study human command structure if they're supposedly primitive?" Korthak's laugh was a chittering sound that made several students uncomfortable. "Excellent question, Cadet Yilos. We study them because these primitive humans have defeated every major military force they've encountered, including us." The reminder hung in the air like a toxic cloud. 3 years had passed since the disastrous Battle of Proxima 7, where human forces had somehow managed to outmaneuver the combined fleets of the Hegemony Coalition. The defeat still stung like acid in Korthak's memory. "Now then," he said, calling up a new holographic display, "let us examine their most dangerous battlefield commanders. First, we have General Patricia Yates, known for her unconventional armor tactics during the siege of Kepler Station. The image showed a middle-aged human female with graying hair and intense brown eyes. Her service record scrolled beside her portrait, listing victories that should have been impossible given the technological disadvantages her forces faced. General Yates pioneered what humans call adaptive battlefield doctrine, which essentially means throwing out established military strategy and making up new tactics on the spot, Korthak explained. Completely insane, naturally, but surprisingly effective against opponents who expect logical behavior. More holographic portraits appeared as he continued his lecture. Next, we have Admiral Burton Mills, architect of the Titan Nebula campaign. His strategy of using merchant vessels as decoy capital ships resulted in the complete destruction of the 4th Hegemony battle group. A student with crystalline skin formations raised her hand. "Dr. Senex, how do we counter enemies who refuse to follow established tactical doctrine?" "That, Cadet Physex, is why we're studying them so extensively. Human unpredictability appears to be their greatest weapon." Korthak's secondary eyes focused on the student, while his primary eyes remained fixed on his lecture notes. They seem incapable of accepting defeat as a logical outcome, even when facing overwhelming odds. The next holographic display showed a younger human male with short dark hair and numerous battle scars visible on his exposed arms. Colonel Trevor Stone, specialist in urban combat operations. His defense of New Geneva lasted 14 standard months against siege forces that outnumbered his troops 50-1. "Impossible," muttered a lizard-like cadet from the back row. "That's what we thought too, Cadet Stek. Yet the siege records are quite clear. Stone's forces held the city until reinforcements arrived, using tactics that our best military analysts still can't fully comprehend." Korthak paused to take a sip of his nutrient solution, letting the information sink in. His students looked appropriately disturbed by the implications. Good. Fear was a useful teacher when dealing with human warfare. "Perhaps most concerning of all," he continued, "is their apparent ability to produce effective leaders from their general population without formal military breeding programs. Unlike our carefully cultivated warrior castes, humans seem to generate tactical genius randomly." The holographic display shifted to show a new portrait. This one depicted a human female who appeared younger than the others, with auburn hair tied back in a practical style and piercing green eyes that seemed to stare directly at the viewer. Finally, we come to Lieutenant Colonel Denver Wade, perhaps their most decorated field commander under the age of 30 standard years. Her rapid rise through the ranks has baffled our intelligence analysts, particularly given her civilian background. Korthak activated the detailed service record, watching as an impressive list of victories filled the air above his students' heads. Wade's specialty appears to be small unit operations behind enemy lines. Her success rate in these missions is, well, let's just say it defies statistical probability. A particularly attentive student raised multiple arms in question. Dr. Zenex, what makes this Wade individual so dangerous compared to other human commanders? An excellent question, Cadet Morphex. According to our intelligence reports, Wade possesses an unusual combination of tactical brilliance and psychological insight. She seems capable of predicting enemy behavior patterns with uncanny accuracy. The lecture hall fell silent as students absorbed this information. Korthak noted with satisfaction that several of them were taking detailed notes on their personal recording devices. Understanding human military capabilities was crucial for anyone planning a career in strategic planning or xenological warfare. Wade's most notable victory occurred during the Battle of Arcturus Prime, where she led a force of just 200 soldiers against an entrenched enemy position, defended by over 3,000 troops. Korthak's mandibles clicked as he accessed the battle records. Intelligence suggests she accomplished this by infiltrating the enemy command structure and eliminating key leadership personnel. He was about to continue when a voice from the middle of the lecture hall interrupted him. Actually, Dr. Zenex, I think you've got the name wrong. Korthak's compound eyes swiveled to locate the speaker. It was one of the exchange students, a human female sitting near the center of the auditorium. She appeared to be in her late 20s, with short blonde hair and an unremarkable appearance that had allowed her to blend in with the other students until now. Excuse me? Korthak's voice carried a note of irritation. I don't believe I invited questions about accuracy of Imperial intelligence reports. The human student stood up slowly, her movement causing a ripple of attention throughout the lecture hall. The thing is, Dr. Zenex, I was there during the Battle of Arcturus Prime, and the officer you're talking about isn't Lieutenant Colonel Denver Wade. The lecture hall erupted in surprised chittering and whistling from various species. Korthak felt his mandibles lock in shock as the implications of the human's statement began to sink in. You're claiming to have first-hand knowledge of classified military operations, he asked, his voice taking on a dangerous tone. That's a rather bold assertion for an exchange student. The human smiled, and Korthak felt a chill run through his exoskeleton. There was something predatory about that expression that set off every survival instinct his species had evolved over millions of years. Oh, I have more than first-hand knowledge, Doctor. You see, the officer you're describing is actually Colonel Emma Vale, not Denver Wade. Common mistake in intelligence reports, apparently. Similar operational profiles, both blonde, both young for their ranks. Korthak's secondary brain began processing this information while his primary consciousness struggled to maintain composure. And how exactly would an exchange student know such specific details about classified personnel files? The human's smile widened. Because I'm Emma Vale. The silence that followed was so complete that Korthak could hear the hum of the lecture hall's environmental systems. 200 alien students sat frozen in their seats, staring at the unremarkable human female who had just identified herself as one of the most dangerous military commanders in known space. That's impossible, Korthak stammered, his forearms gesturing helplessly. Emma Vale is a high-priority target. She would never be allowed to attend an enemy academic institution. Well, technically, this isn't an enemy institution anymore, Vale said, her tone conversational. The peace accords were signed 6 months ago, remember? Besides, who's going to look for a notorious military commander in a classroom full of college students? Korthak's mind raced as he tried to process this development. His carefully prepared lecture had just been derailed by the appearance of one of his primary subject matters. The irony wasn't lost on him, but he was too shocked to appreciate it properly. You're seriously claiming to be Emma Vale? He asked, hoping desperately that this was some kind of elaborate student prank. I'm not claiming anything, Doctor. I am Emma Vale, and I can tell you exactly what happened at Arcturus Prime, since I was the one who planned and executed the operation. The human female's casual tone made her words even more chilling. She spoke about military operations the way other people discuss their weekend plans. Furthermore, she continued, your intelligence reports contain several significant errors about the battle. For instance, we didn't infiltrate the enemy command structure. We eliminated it entirely and replaced it with our own personnel. Korthak felt his academic worldview crumbling around him. Replaced it? How is that possible? Humans are remarkably good at mimicking other species' behavioral patterns, Vale explained. It's a survival trait we developed long before we reached the stars. A few days of observation, some basic prosthetics, and suddenly you've got enemy commanders who think and act exactly like the originals. The auditorium remained silent, except for the nervous rustling of students who were beginning to realize they were in the presence of a legendary figure. Several of them had probably studied her tactics in their own military academies. Of course, Vale continued. The real trick wasn't replacing the commanders. It was making sure they gave orders that seemed logical from their perspective, but were actually designed to create maximum confusion and chaos among their own forces. Korthak's mandibles clicked involuntarily as he processed this information. You turned the enemy command structure against itself. Exactly. Much more efficient than trying to fight our way through 3,000 entrenched defenders. Why waste ammunition when you can convince the enemy to defeat themselves? A student near the back of the hall raised a tentative appendage. Colonel Vale, if that's really who you are, how many enemy commanders did you personally eliminate during the operation? Vale's expression became thoughtful, as if she were trying to remember something mildly important. Personally, just the overall field commander and his immediate staff. Maybe 8 or 9 individuals total. The rest of the leadership structure was neutralized by my team members. The casual way she discussed assassination made Korthak's exoskeleton crawl. This was the kind of predatory efficiency that made humans so terrifying to face in combat. But I thought you said you replaced the command structure, protested another student. We did. After we eliminated the original commanders, we took their places and began issuing contradictory orders designed to fragment unit cohesion. It's amazing how quickly a well-disciplined force can collapse when their officers start giving them conflicting instructions. Korthak realized that his carefully planned lecture had become something entirely different. Instead of teaching his students about human military theory, he was now witnessing a first-hand account from one of the most successful practitioners of human warfare. Colonel Vale, he said, attempting to regain some semblance of academic authority. While your presence here is unexpected, I must ask why you chose to reveal yourself during my lecture. Vale's smile became almost predatory. Well, Doctor, I couldn't let you continue spreading inaccurate information about my operations. Academic integrity is important, don't you think? The auditorium erupted in nervous laughter from several species. Korthak realized that his students were now more interested in their unexpected guest lecturer than in his prepared curriculum. Besides, Vale continued, I thought your students might benefit from hearing about human military tactics from someone who's actually used them in combat. Theory is useful, but practical experience tends to be more educational. Korthak felt control of his classroom slipping away like sand through his fingers. And what exactly do you propose to teach them? How about the truth about human warfare? Your intelligence reports are remarkably thorough in some areas and completely wrong in others. For instance, you mentioned that humans generate tactical genius randomly from our general population. That assessment is based on extensive analysis of human military leadership patterns, Korthak protested. It's also completely backwards, Vale said with amusement. We don't generate tactical genius randomly. We generate it systematically by creating educational and social systems that encourage creative problem-solving and independent thinking. The implications of this statement hung in the air like a challenge. If humans could systematically produce military leaders of Vale's caliber, then the threat they represented was far greater than anyone had realized. Every human child learns to question authority, to think outside established parameters, and to find creative solutions to impossible problems, Vale explained. What you call random tactical genius is actually the predictable result of a society that values innovation over conformity. Korthak felt his academic confidence evaporating. Are you suggesting that human military superiority is based on social engineering rather than individual brilliance? I'm not suggesting it, Doctor. I'm stating it as fact. The reason human forces consistently defeat supposedly superior enemies is because we've spent centuries training our entire population to think like generals, innovators, and problem solvers. The lecture hall had become completely silent as students absorbed this revelation. The implications were staggering. If Vale was correct, then human military capability wasn't limited to their current forces. It was embedded in their entire civilization. Dr. Korthak's forearms trembled slightly as he processed the magnitude of what Colonel Vale had just revealed. Around the lecture hall, students from 17 different species sat in stunned silence, their various sensory organs focused entirely on the unassuming human female who had just redefined their understanding of galactic warfare. Colonel Vale, he managed, his voice carrying a tremor that betrayed his academic composure. Are you seriously telling us that human society deliberately cultivates military thinking in civilians? Vale leaned back in her seat with casual confidence. Not military thinking specifically, Doctor. Critical thinking. Problem solving. The ability to question assumptions and find unconventional solutions. It just happens that these skills translate remarkably well to tactical situations. A student with bioluminescent skin patterns raised several tentacles. But Colonel, doesn't that make your entire population a potential military threat? The human's laugh was genuinely amused. Only if you consider creativity and independent thought to be threats. Which, given how most galactic civilizations organize themselves, I suppose you might. Korthak felt his mandibles click nervously. Are you implying that our social structures are fundamentally flawed? I'm not implying anything, Doctor. I'm stating that rigid hierarchical systems optimized for control and predictability are inherently vulnerable to opponents who refuse to follow the rules you've built those systems around. The lecture hall erupted in agitated chittering and whistling as students began to grasp the implications. Vale waited patiently for the noise to subside before continuing. Take the Battle of Arcturus Prime, for example. Your forces followed textbook defensive doctrine. Establish perimeter, fortify positions, maintain communication networks, protect command structure. All very logical and predictable. Korthak found himself leaning forward despite his growing discomfort. And that was a mistake? It was a roadmap. Once we understood your operational patterns, defeating you became a matter of basic psychology rather than superior firepower. Vale's green eyes seemed to twinkle with amusement. You see, Doctor, most species fight the way they think, hierarchically. Top-down command structure, clear chains of authority, established protocols for every situation. A reptilian student in the front row hissed softly. And humans fight differently. Humans fight the way we live. Chaotically, creatively, with multiple parallel decision-making processes and constant adaptation to changing circumstances. Vale gestured around the lecture hall. Think about it. How many of you could take over this classroom if your instructor suddenly disappeared? The question hung in the air like a toxic spore. Korthak realized with growing horror that most of his students were looking around uncertainly, clearly unable to conceive of functioning without proper authority figures. Exactly my point, Vale continued. In human society, every individual is trained from childhood to take initiative, make decisions, and adapt to unexpected situations. We call it personal responsibility, but it's really distributed command authority. That sounds like anarchy, protested a student with metallic exoskeleton plating. Only from the perspective of a species that equates order with rigid control, Vale replied. We prefer to think of it as resilient flexibility. Cut off the head of most galactic military forces, and the body dies. Cut off the head of a human force, and 12 new leaders emerge to take its place. Korthak felt his academic worldview continuing its complete collapse. But surely there must be some central authority coordinating human military operations. Of course there is. But authority in human systems flows both up and down the chain of command. A private who sees a tactical opportunity doesn't need to wait for orders from headquarters. They're trained and trusted to act on their own initiative. The implications were staggering. Korthak had spent decades studying human military capabilities, but he'd been analyzing them through the lens of conventional galactic warfare. He'd completely missed the fundamental difference in how humans organize their society. "Let me give you a practical example," Vale said, standing up and moving to the front of the lecture hall. "Doctor, may I use your holographic projector?" Korthak nodded numbly, stepping aside as Vale took control of his own classroom. The irony wasn't lost on him that a human was now teaching his students about human warfare. "Let's recreate the Arcturus Prime scenario," Vale said, manipulating the holographic controls with practiced ease. "Here's the defensive position your forces occupied. Textbook perfect. Overlapping fields of fire, protected command bunker, secure communication lines." The three-dimensional battlefield materialized above the students' heads, complete with topographical details and unit positions. Korthak had to admit it was an impressive defensive setup. Now, traditional galactic military doctrine would suggest a frontal assault, siege tactics, or orbital bombardment to deal with this position, all of which would result in massive casualties and uncertain outcomes. Vale highlighted various approach routes on the holographic display, each one clearly suicidal for attacking forces. The defensive advantages were overwhelming. But humans don't. Humans think in terms of attacking the enemy's strengths. We attack their assumptions. The holographic display shifted, showing new tactical overlays that made Korthak's compound eyes widen. Your command structure assumed that any attacking force would behave logically. They positioned their defenses to counter rational tactical approaches. They never considered that someone might deliberately choose seemingly irrational strategies. The display showed a series of infiltration routes that appeared to violate basic military common sense. Units moving through obvious kill zones, communications being deliberately broadcast on open channels, supply lines left completely undefended. "This is madness," whispered a student with chitinous features. "Those approach vectors guarantee detection and destruction." "Only if the defenders react predictably," Vale replied with a smile. "But what if the point isn't to avoid detection? What if the point is to make the enemy so confused by your apparent incompetence that they second-guess their own tactical assessments?" Korthak felt his secondary brain struggling to process this concept. "You're suggesting that appearing incompetent is a tactical advantage. I'm suggesting that making your enemies question their own assumptions is more valuable than superior firepower. If you can make them doubt their intelligence reports, their tactical assessments, and their operational doctrine all at once, they become paralyzed by uncertainty." The holographic display showed the actual timeline of the Arcturus Prime battle. Human forces had indeed approached through the most dangerous vectors, broadcasting obvious communications, and apparently making every mistake possible. The defending commanders faced a dilemma, Vale explained. Either the attacking humans were completely incompetent, or this was some kind of elaborate deception. Since incompetence seemed more likely, they initially ignored the threat. But surely they adapted once the true nature of the attack became clear, asked a student with crystalline sensory organs. They tried to, but by then it was too late. You see, while they were focused on the obvious diversionary attacks, the real infiltration teams had already penetrated their perimeter, using routes that no rational military planner would consider. The display showed secondary infiltration paths that went through seemingly impossible terrain. Underground tunnels, vertical cliff faces, even underwater approaches that required specialized equipment. These routes were all considered impassable by conventional forces, Vale continued, which is exactly why we use them. Human soldiers are trained to operate in environments that other species consider uninhabitable. Korthak's mandibles clicked rapidly as he processed this information. "Are you saying that human military advantage comes from biological adaptability?" "Partly. But more importantly, it comes from psychological adaptability. We're trained from childhood to view obstacles as problems to solve rather than barriers to avoid." A student near the back raised multiple appendages. "Colonel Vale, How do we defend against enemies who refuse to follow logical tactical doctrine? The question seemed to hang in the air like a challenge. Vale's expression became thoughtful, as if she were considering whether to answer honestly. That's the real problem, isn't it? She said finally. How do you prepare for opponents who actively reject predictability? The answer is that you probably can't, at least not with current galactic military thinking. What do you mean? Korthak asked, though he suspected he wouldn't like the answer. Your entire approach to warfare is based on establishing superior positions and forcing enemies to attack your strengths. It works well against other species who think the same way. But humans specialize in making established positions irrelevant. Vale manipulated the holographic display to show a broader strategic view. Instead of asking how to defend against human tactics, you should be asking why humans developed such tactics in the first place. And why did they? Asked a student with bioluminescent communication organs. Because we evolved on a planet that was actively trying to kill us every single day. Earth doesn't have the stable, predictable environments that most galactic species evolved in. We had to develop extreme adaptability just to survive. The implications hit Korthak like a physical blow. You're saying that human military capabilities are an extension of evolutionary survival traits. Exactly. Every human child learns to deal with unexpected threats, changing conditions, and resource limitations. What you call unconventional tactics, we call Tuesday. The lecture hall fell silent as students absorbed this revelation. Several species began making rapid calculations on their personal devices, presumably trying to assess the implications for their own military doctrines. But surely, protested a student with metallic plating, there must be some way to counter human unpredictability? Vale's smile became predatory. There is, actually, but you're not going to like it. What is it? Korthak asked, though he was beginning to dread the answer. Stop trying to control every variable. Start training your personnel to think independently. Encourage creativity and innovation rather than conformity and obedience. In other words, become more like humans. The suggestion was met with horrified silence from most of the students. For species that had built their entire civilizations around hierarchical control and predictable behavior, Vale's recommendation was tantamount to suggesting societal suicide. That's impossible, breathed a student with compound sensory arrays. Our social structures couldn't survive that kind of change. Then you'll keep losing to humans, Vale replied matter-of-factly. The choice is yours. Korthak felt the weight of 40 years of academic certainty crumbling around him. Colonel Vale, are you seriously suggesting that human military superiority will force other species to fundamentally alter their social organization? I'm not suggesting anything, Doctor. I'm observing that species adapt or they get replaced. Humans have demonstrated a form of warfare that makes traditional military thinking obsolete. The rest of the galaxy can either evolve or accept permanent subordination. The brutal honesty of the statement hit the lecture hall like a shockwave. Students who had entered expecting a routine academic discussion found themselves confronting the possibility that their entire civilizations might need to change or face extinction. Of course, Vale continued with apparent casualness, there is another option. Which is? Korthak asked desperately. Join us. Human society is remarkably inclusive. We've got room for anyone willing to embrace individual responsibility and creative problem-solving. The transition period can be challenging, but most species adapt remarkably well once they stop trying to maintain rigid social hierarchies. A student with bioluminescent patterns raised several appendages. Are you offering us recruitment into human military forces? I'm suggesting that the distinction between human and non-human might be less important than the distinction between adaptive and rigid thinking patterns. Biology is just hardware. Culture is the operating system that really matters. Korthak realized that Vale had just casually suggested the most radical social transformation in galactic history. She was proposing nothing less than the absorption of other species into human culture, not through conquest, but through voluntary adoption of human social and psychological principles. This conversation has moved far beyond military tactics, he observed. Has it? Vale asked. Or have you finally realized that military tactics are inseparable from social organization? The way a species fights reflects the way they think, which reflects the way they organize their society. She gestured around the lecture hall, encompassing all the diverse alien students. Every one of you represents a military potential that your own species has never fully realized, because you've been trained to follow orders rather than think independently. And you believe we could all become effective human-style military leaders? Asked a student with crystalline sensory organs. I believe you could all become effective human-style problem solvers, which amounts to the same thing. The specific application, whether military or civilian, is just a matter of context. Korthak felt his worldview completing its total reconstruction. Colonel Vale, when you chose to reveal yourself today, was this educational discussion your primary objective? Vale's smile was genuinely warm for the first time since she'd identified herself. Dr. Zenex, when I enrolled in your class 6 months ago, I was looking for insight into how other species perceive human military capabilities. What I found was something much more valuable, which was an opportunity to start a conversation about the future of galactic civilization. Your students represent the next generation of leaders for 17 different species. If they leave here today understanding that adaptation and creativity are more valuable than rigid hierarchy and predictable behavior, then maybe we can avoid the wars that everyone seems to think are inevitable. The lecture hall remained silent as students processed this revelation. Vale had apparently been planning this moment for months, using Korthak's own classroom as a platform for diplomatic outreach disguised as military education. So this entire discussion has been a form of psychological warfare, Korthak said, though without anger. This entire discussion has been an attempt at preventing psychological warfare, Vale corrected. The alternative to voluntary cultural adaptation is eventual military conquest. I prefer the voluntary option. She gathered her materials and prepared to leave, pausing at the door to address the still stunned audience. Dr. Zenex, thank you for the opportunity to clarify the historical record. Students, remember that the future belongs to those who can adapt, not to those who can simply follow orders. As the door closed behind her, Korthak found himself staring at 200 alien students who had just received the most important education of their lives. His carefully planned lecture on human military structure had become something far more significant. It had become the first step toward a new kind of galactic civilization. Well, he said finally, his mandibles clicking with what might have been amusement, I believe we'll need to revise the curriculum. The lecture hall erupted in nervous laughter, but Korthak could see the thoughtful expressions on his students' faces. Vale had planted seeds that would grow into ideas that would reshape the galaxy. And it had all started with a simple correction about the name of a military leader she'd killed.